conflict between the US and Venezuela is framed as geopolitical or clash, war, it would have significant implications for the Southern Caribbean region. The Southern Caribbean, which include islands like Trinidad, Barbados, St. Vincent, Grenada, St. Lucia, Martinique, Dominica, these low islands, they would be impacted in various ways, both directly and indirectly. And so I want to get into that a little bit on different flanks because people are just talking about Trinidad, Venezuela, and the US. But it's more than that. It's the Southern Caribbean region, really. One of the ways in which I think we're going to see problems is the increased political and diplomatic tensions. It's already started. Venezuela has long been what I would say a contentious point in the US Latin America relations. And the Southern Caribbean, due to its proximity, I would say, to Venezuela, is often caught in the crossfire of these political dynamics. It's nothing new, really. And any significant escalation in the US Venezuela tensions, be it military conflict, further sanctions, or diplomatic isolation, could force the Southern Caribbean islands into difficult political positions. That brings to the question of political pressure. Now, Caribbean countries will face pressure from both the US and Venezuela to align with their respective positions. For instance, the US has historically pressured Caribbean nations to support its stance against the Venezuelan government, whether it was under Chavez or now under Maduro. Venezuela has also attempted to leverage its regional alliances, especially within groups like ALBA, which many of these smaller islands are involved with. And then you have the diplomatic neutrality. Many of the Southern Caribbean nations, especially the smaller ones like St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, they would likely try to maintain a stance of neutrality or at least avoid being seen as chosen sides in such a conflict. As you can see in Grenada, where a radar was supposed to go up to today, you don't know. However, you have countries like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, or even Barbados, who have had long standing diplomatic relations with both the US and Venezuela, complicating any clear alignment. So there's a problem. Then you're going to be faced with the migration crisis and refugees. Venezuela, as you know, is already experiencing one of the largest migration crises in the world. That since the economic collapse under Maduro regime, of course, brought on by sanctions from the United States of America. A lot of people have fled Venezuela, and they're seeking refuge in neighboring countries. In the Caribbean and Latin America, Trinidad has been swamped, as you know, and there will be more if there is extended conflict, and they will come up the island chain. And so you have increased refugee flow. A war further with the US sanctions could escalate the outflow of Venezuelan refugees to neighboring islands. So countries like Trinidad and Tobago have already seen significant Venezuelan migration in recent years, and an intensification of the crisis could put additional strain on their social services and infrastructure. Don't talk about islands like Grenada and St. Vincent. They will come up the island chain. And now you have that will add to the social and economic strain. So while some of these migrants may bring economic activity to the region, example through the labor, the large influx of the refugees could exacerbate our social tensions, especially in the smaller islands with limited resources. Really don't have much resources to play around with. So the economic impact is going to be big. You have trade and sanctions where the Southern Caribbean economies are closely tied to both the US and Venezuela, especially in terms of trade. You have energy and tourism. So you see tourism in the north, energy from the south. Now, Venezuela, with its oil wealth, has historically been a key trading partner. And so disruptions in trade could have a ripple effect, as already you've seen they're saying in Trinidad that without Venezuela, some of the projects cannot go forward, the Venezuelan oil. So there's impact on oil and energy, where Venezuela is a major oil producer. And while US sanctions have already significantly reduced trade between the two countries, you're talking a full scale conflict could disrupt regional energy markets even more. Trinidad and Tobago, for example, is one of the few countries in the Caribbean that produces oil and gas. And Any disruption in Venezuelan output could shift energy markets in the region. On the other hand, you have Trinidad could benefit from an increase in oil prices if Venezuelan's production falters. So there's so many dynamics at play. Now, the economic sanctions, right, and the trade shifts we have to look at as well. Because the US sanctions against Venezuela have already reduced trade and investment opportunities, I would say, in the region. And and any escalation could would exacerbate the economic challenges for all of these neighboring Caribbean nations that rely on trade. Now, Caribbean nations may also face pressure. Note I say, they may also face pressure to comply with the sanctions, potentially jeopardizing their trade relations with Venezuela, which could result in loss of revenue, especially in countries that have, I would say, close economic ties, like Guyana. Now, if you look at the Southern Caribbean on the issue of tourism, which is really important and very vital, the Caribbean's tourism sector is another area that could be affected. The US travel restrictions to Venezuela could increase the appeal of nearby islands as safe tourist destinations. However, escalating tensions could also scare off tourists who fear instability in the region, and we are already seeing some of that happening with lesser cruise visits taking place. And then you have the security and the military tensions. I mean, the Southern Caribbean is strategically located near US and Latin America and Venezuela, which is making it an important area for military and security interests. Therein lies a lot of problem. The U.S. military presence in this region is already causing tensions, sparks, fear, and they already maintain a presence in the Caribbean region through both bases in, I would say, Puerto Rico, and they have cooperation with various island nations like Trinidad and Tobago. But of course, any escalation of tensions with Venezuela could increase US military activity in the region. And we've seen it. We've seen all the escalation of the US military exercises, the intelligence sharing, and even some of them where they have temporary bases or deployments, like what we're seeing now, temporary radars in Trinidad and all that kind of stuff. So the regional security issues should be of great concern to a lot of us. Venezuela could also turn to its regional allies, such as Cuba or Nicaragua, in a heightened conflict, which could further have security ramifications for the Southern Caribbean. Noting that people are saying that Cuba really has not much to offer to Venezuela. But Cuba works along with Russia, so therein lies out another problem as well. But an increase in arms trafficking or political instability in nearby Venezuela could exacerbate crime or destabilize governments in the Southern Caribbean, which could impact their ability to maintain internal order. Of course, on that issue, you would have seen some changes, like in St. Vincent or even Trinidad when Rowley came out, and now in St. Vincent with Gonzalez is out. And if you notice, there's a shift where you're trying to have these American aligned governments in power, or those who are softer on the narrative towards the US. So, in terms of internal order, you may not have much of a problem, but we'll wait and see what plays out in the coming weeks and months. Now, this regional military buildup that we're having, the risk of the conflict spilling over into different islands, actually it can happen. And in the region, what they'll have to do to strengthen their own defense capabilities, not much they can do there. But the risk of becoming an unintended battleground, especially through proxy military or political interventions, could lead to increased spending on defense capabilities and infrastructure in the Southern Caribbean. That is going to put a lot of other things at risk in terms of internal things like health, dealing with the social issues. So if you're going to be spending more on defense because you're caught up in the game and you're put at risk, it puts a lot of pressure on your government. And of course, there's always the environmental impact. I never heard anybody speaking about it much, but there's also the environmental impact. It's not directly tied to the US Venezuela conflict, but the environmental impact of escalating tensions cannot be ignored. I believe that the Southern Caribbean is already vulnerable to, people say, things like hurricanes, rising levels, and all of that, sea levels and stuff like that. And military conflicts, of course, could exacerbate a lot of issues, not rising sea levels, but you have the oil and the chemical spills that can occur whenever there's an escalation in conflict, especially in the form of military strike on oil facilities or refineries, which could have a lot of devastating effects on the environment. A lot of people are not talking about that part, but I believe that is very, very important. So the Southern Caribbean is a sensitive area, particularly when it comes to biodiversity, and we have to pay attention to anything that can cause oil spills or chemical contamination from any military conflict, whether it's near the Venezuelan shore or near any of our shores, as a matter of fact, in the region. So, guys, I just want you to pay attention to these things. War can you can see displacement of people. It can lead to environmental degradation. You can have, particularly in terms of the habitat destruction, you can have deforestation. You can have a loss of biodiversity and increase in displaced Venezuelans, of course, could lead to further pressure on the region's, I would say, natural resources. So there's a lot of things to consider. Operation. So, guys, thanks a lot. Think about these things, a lot to think about, and leave your comments in the section below.